It's inauguration week, and there's a lot of heat in the kitchen, no doubt.
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
You know, it's kind of fascinating. This president-elect goes in with the lowest popularity ratings of any pre-election president in history. He tells you it's all phony numbers because nothing's real, everything's fake, nothing matters. Data doesn't count unless it's generated from him. It's a weird time, no doubt. Important show tonight. Congressman David Cicilline is my guest. The Congressman and I haven't had a broadcast dialogue in years, and so I'm happy to finally break that ice again. And I promised him, and I'm promising you, there is just too much Washington conversation here to get in the way of anything else that we've got in terms of what's happening locally. But hopefully this rekindles a good working relationship with the Congressman and me for your purposes, and we'll have some fun here this evening. I'm going to forget the rundown, my thoughts on other issues, and there are plenty, so stay tuned to WPRO weekdays 3 to 6, because Governor Raimondo is throwing all sorts of monkey wrenches into conversations, including free tuition and blah, 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 but we'll get to those in due time, even this week. Here's the latest of what's happening in Washington right now.
President-elect Donald Trump's inauguration is just 3 days away, and it's shaping up to be one of the most controversial in recent memory. So far, more than 35 House Democrats pledged to boycott Mr. Trump's speech after his attacks on iconic civil rights leader and Georgia Congressman John Lewis, who cast doubt on the legitimacy of Mr. Trump's presidency. Mr. Trump's advisor, Kellyanne Conway, defended the president-elect.
It's like being the walking wounded, right? Everybody's always gunning for us, and we're just supposed to look the other way.
Congressman Lewis chose not to react to the president-elect's words while celebrating the Martin Luther King holiday.
As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, hate is too heavy a burden to bear.
Nearly 1 million people are expected to attend the swearing-in, and hundreds of organizations plan to protest.
All of the controversy and all the skepticism that continues from the campaign, in a typically American way, will vanish in that moment of power transferring from partisan to partisan.
And today, Russian President Vladimir Putin accused the outgoing Obama administration of attempting to undermine Mr. Trump's presidency. He said those who spread fake allegations are, quote, worse than prostitutes. Putin is referring to a dossier of unverified claims against Mr. Trump during a past visit to Moscow.
So look, there's a lot in there, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that I want to take, one step at a time if we can. Here's the conversation that I want to talk to you about. This is a headline on the Hill. This was Donald Trump's position last week. We have another slide here that kind of reflects on this, that most Americans polled think he should, and then Congressman Cicilline put this out, embargoed up until this morning early. That's kind of a rewrite of the headline of his press release. More evidence emerges of Russia's preference for Trump and the president-elect's refusal to divest. Congressman Cicilline reintroduces legislation requiring disclosure of tax returns. And with that, we bring you on. Hey, Happy New Year.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming.
My pleasure.
What's that going to do?
Well, as you know, it has been the tradition since 1977, started with Jimmy Carter, that every presidential candidate of both major political parties have released their tax returns as a way to share with the American people what potential conflicts might exist, where their investments are, where they have business interests. And that's always been the tradition, Republican and Democrat. Donald Trump is the first presidential candidate and now president-elect who has refused to do that and had hidden behind this "I'm under audit," which of course doesn't preclude its release. So this piece of legislation, which I introduced with 20 colleagues, will require a president once inaugurated to release his tax returns for the previous 3 years within 90 days. If he refuses to do that, it directs the Secretary of the Treasury to release the returns. It's important because a number of issues have already been raised about, as Mr. Trump proudly says, he has business investments all over the world. He has licensing agreements all over the world. And the current conflict of interest laws don't cover the president. Many of those, it's only the emoluments clause in the Constitution. So at least understanding where those interests are so that we can have confidence that he's making decisions in the best interest of the American people and not to advance some financial gain for himself or his company is important. I think in the context of what we've learned about the Russian interference in our elections, it's even more important that we understand this. So I'm hoping that this will be a bipartisan effort that everyone will recognize that it's important that we get this information.
It won't be.
So far, it is not, but I'm optimistic and hopeful that I think there. Look, in the Senate, you see Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator John McCain, who have been very outspoken proponents of an independent review of Russian interference in our elections, who have really said this is serious. So I think there are people who are going to be willing to be part of this effort, but at least so far, the co-sponsors are all Democrats.
Well, the two customary things to do is kind of have some, as you give terrific historical context to, financial via tax return, health. And at some juncture, we may want to revisit, not from, I'm not sure a legislative point of view on the health thing, but in as much as we have a bipartisan effort to create fair debate via the networks, perhaps a bipartisan effort to disclose health issues, which dragged Hillary Clinton down, no doubt, perhaps unnecessarily. We'll see. I mean, her falling down in that van, everyone wants to talk about Comey and leaks and Russia being her downfall. It didn't help her, wiping out in the heat in front of that van. We'll never be able to actually rewrite what it exactly was that cost her that election, other than her perhaps missing, as Joe Biden would tell you, half of middle America in her politics. You want a quick thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I want to say one thing. The thing that further complicates this is, don't forget that unlike every other president who's put their assets into a blind trust, a real blind trust, to protect against these conflicts, Donald Trump has refused to do that. And the Office of Government Ethics said his proposal doesn't protect it. So you take that, coupled with his massive investments around the world, and it really does present real dangers. But to your question about Secretary Clinton and about missing half America, one of the responsibilities I have in my new position as one of the co-chairs of the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee is to really set the Democratic priorities for the next 2 years, but also to be sure that we're developing a message that communicates with the American people about what we stand for, what we're fighting for. And this is an area where there's enormous evidence that the Democrats and the Clinton campaign in particular did not respond to this sort of working class of middle America who saw their jobs go overseas, who saw the companies they work for close, and who, what Donald Trump said is, I'm bringing the jobs back, which of course is ridiculous. It's not going to happen. But he at least acknowledged this demographic existed.
It's not going to happen. Why?
Well, you're not going to bring back coal. You're not going to bring back, places where people are working for $1 an hour to produce a product. So those, we have advanced manufacturing, which is growing substantially, particularly in places like Rhode Island. But the point is to acknowledge that people are really hurting, that people have been working harder, 2 and 3 jobs just to get by, and are seeing kind of their future slip away. They can't send their kids to college.
And you guys
they can't save for their, absolutely. And I think, when you have a presidential campaign, I think lots of Democrats spoke about it, but the presidential campaign sets the narrative for the campaign.
By the way, this was a question I was going to ask you later in the show, but while we're talking about message and missing message, I mean, you have the iffy 50-50 challenge in a term or two to have to worry about one district in Rhode Island, depending on how the census data comes out. You have an urban setting in Providence that buoys your re-election chances more and more each time. I mean, you're pretty locked in as a first district congressman unless all hell broke loose or you got involved in a scandal or God knows whatever. I mean, some major heavy hitter comes your way. However, the rest of the state's a bigger challenge. If you end up ever having if we end up suffering the blow of losing a district, and you could fall into that same kind of category of different demographic, because this state, if you take a look at all of those voting areas that went Donald Trump, is also sending the same message that the Midwest did.
Yeah, I mean,
you get that, don't you?
I think the reality, I mean, the thing I worry about is it's not about an individual kind of, whether it's Jim or me. The reality is it would be harmful to Rhode Island if we lose a seat. Our legislative delegation's cut in half in the House. That's not good for Rhode Island, sort of kick in the stomach. Hopefully we'll get more folks to move to Rhode Island and we won't confront that.
Well, you better move the realtors along because
right.
our population is
No,
stagnant.
it's been stagnant. But the problem is, what I've focused on, and I explain this to my colleagues, all the Rhode Island's in New England, you go to the northern part of my state, of my district, where you see lots and lots of empty mills that once were filled with jewelry and textile workers, Pawtucket, Woonsocket. So it's the Rust Belt has the same experience as we do in northern parts of our district.
But
So,
you've got a different political culture that's protected you here.
no, but my point is, I think, one of the things that I've really focused on is, I think what people want is someone who's going to work to create economic opportunity, create jobs. And so I don't think I think people are a lot less interested in the social issues. I mean, I'm very progressive, obviously. My experience is, though, that people are interested in people having an opportunity, having a fair shot, but they want to be able to find a job, support themselves, support their family, save for their retirement, send their kids to school. My experience is if we had done that as a national party, we would have had greater success. I think there wasn't enough conversation about what we need to do to help create good paying jobs, because people have seen their incomes remain flat. They're working harder, sometimes 2 and 3 jobs. The cost of college for their kids is going through the roof. They're having a sense that they just can't get ahead. And we were missing, I think, a very strong economic message.
It's pretty good self-actualization. Speaking of economic issues, pardon me with the congressman for a second, I just want to let you know that at Navigant Credit Union, you can control your debit card right from your phone. Yes, this Card Valet app is kind of neat. You can literally shut down your card if you don't want anybody to have access to it in an emergency or just for convenience. There's all sorts of depositing checks, transferring money, setting limits on your spending activities that go along with this Card Valet project that Navigant Credit Union has embarked on. It is another way that Navigant Credit Union makes your journey easier. Navigant Credit Union, check it out. Be right back with the congressman. Stay with us.
I believe in forgiveness. I believe in trying to work with people. It's going to be hard. It's going to be very difficult. I don't see this president-elect as a legitimate president.
You do not consider him a legitimate president. Why is that?
I think the Russians participated in helping this man get elected, and they helped destroy the candidacy of Hillary Clinton.
Saw that first at the end of last week, made mention of it on the radio when it first came off Meet the Press. This guy has icon written all over him, but Manischewitz, I don't like the message. I am not a Trump guy. The message is to the rest of the world, we just elected an illegitimate guy to the most important position in the free world.
Yeah.
And the illegitimate guy acts illegitimately. Let's show you some tweets. And the little tweeting war. Congressman Cicilline lets his fingers do the walking himself. Congressman John Lewis should finally focus on the burning and crime-infested inner cities. Was that tweet 1 or tweet 2? I can't remember which. Oh yeah, that was tweet 1. All of a sudden, someone told Donald Trump that his district is actually middle class and actually in much better shape than he would allege.
Right.
He's not representing the ghettos in Atlanta,
Some
right?
very wealthy parts of Atlanta.
Right, and then the second one was kind of like, oops, well, I could use his help on some other things. You come firing along with your own ammunition, along with a whole bunch of others, and some dozen or so tweets. Might as well show them. You want to walk me through some of the things you said there?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, you don't have to read
No,
them. Just
I mean,
talk to me about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I thought it was very important. First of all, when I read that, I thought, actually, is this really happening? The incoming president of the United States is attacking a civil rights icon and claiming all he does is talk, not a man of action. I had the privilege of welcoming John Lewis here to Rhode Island last year. I went to Selma and Montgomery with him when he reenacted the Civil Rights March over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I consider serving with John Lewis one of the greatest honors of my life. And to know what this man has gone through and that he was almost killed as a nonviolent freedom fighter to help bring voting rights to people all across this country, and literally was almost beaten to death, and persistently has fought, and the work that he's done with me in Congress on the Equality Act and voting rights, the idea of, first of all, to say he's not a man of action and all his talk, I mean, it's absurd.
Well, but the challenge
obscene.
is you're going to have to get used to this as one of 435, and all Americans are going to have to get used to this. His MO is crush the opposition, kill the messenger, the message will go away.
Right.
Whether he morphs and matures or changes is anybody's guess. I wouldn't bet for it.
Yeah.
So
And by the
our
way,
level of exasperation
Yeah.
about this kind of, I mean, John Lewis, I mean, does anybody not get that the reaction to that is, John Lewis is one of the most respected Americans in history. His thoughts are interesting, and I'd like to break bread with him to see if we can't
Right.
come
Well, that's
together.
the point. If he
Instead,
had-
he wants
right.
to inflame it. Then you get involved,
Right.
and now we've got a social media war going on all over Kingdom Come. I don't know when we get down to a grounded conversation anymore.
No, and that's a perfect example. I mean, if the president-elect had tweeted back and said, "I'm sorry John Lewis feels this way, but I look forward to finding a way to work together to move America forward," it would have been a great,
Right.
But you're right, that's not his MO. When he's attacked, he attacks in kind, and whether it's accurate or not is irrelevant. He just sort of makes claims. And the unfortunate part is he's indicated he's going to do more of this, not less of it. Because the one thing that, one of the important roles of the media is if he says, John Lewis has done nothing in his life, the media can say, President-elect Trump has reported John Lewis has done nothing, but in fact he's done X, Y, and Z. If he uses Twitter, he avoids anyone commenting on the truthfulness of what he's claiming, and he can talk directly to millions and millions of Americans. So he's not going to stop doing that. And so,
And he's going to drag guys like you into using that platform. And I'm not listening.
No, I'm not saying that's the look. The reality is, I think what we have to do is we have to be willing to stand up and fight and advocate as strongly as we can against the policies that he's been presenting, both during his campaign and during this transition. That's going to happen in the halls of Congress.
All due respect to John Lewis' stature, which is undeniable, inarguable. It's a really dangerous thing he did there. I get where his heart is. I get how he feels this election has been affected. I get that. But the worldview is only exacerbated here, that we have instability in the White House. I think it's a terrible message. I think he needs to. Aren't you guys? Does anybody? I mean, does anybody link in and say, Congressman, respectfully, can you revisit that, man?
Well, I think here's the 2 points that are really important that John Lewis was making. One is that there are lots of people in this country, I'm one of them, who believe that Donald Trump's campaign and the things he spoke about and the things he's proposing undermine basic American values. And they think it's very important that people understand that what he is saying does not represent the values of this country. And we're going to fight him, and we're going to resist in every way that we can. And I think that's very important for people. I hear from constituents all the time that are really anxious about the future. What is he going to do? How is he going to change America?
Oh, well.
So, no, it's not a well.
Listen, I'm as anxious as anybody else, but there's a suck it up aspect.
No,
to
there's
this
not
whole
a suck it
thing.
up. There's a fight. There's not a suck it up. We don't have to accept it. He is the president. He will be the president as of Friday. But we need to stand up and fight hard.
Well,
that's the first point.
Fight on the issues,
right?
But
the second point is
this hand-wringing psychoanalysis.
No, I'm
thing
not
going
hand-wringing.
on.
I'm done hand-wringing. We've got to stand up, and we have to fight for hardworking families. We have to fight for health care. We have to fight for economic opportunity. We have to fight to make college more affordable, fix our broken immigration system. It's a long list of what we need to do. We've got to get that work done. But the other thing that John Lewis is referencing, which is important, and that is we have got to work together in a bipartisan way, Republicans and Democrats, to secure our democracy. What the Russians did in this election, and there was a public report released, I've been to classified briefings, which I obviously can't talk about, but there's a public document that's unclassified now, that provides some detail of a Russian campaign led by Vladimir Putin to undermine the campaign of Hillary Clinton and to advance the interests and the campaign of Donald Trump. That is fact. 17 intelligence agencies came to the same conclusion.
Well, I mean, even
we
Donald
have
Trump
to
has
protect
been
against
dragged
that.
to that truth.
Right,
I get
finally,
that.
kicking and screaming. What would have been great if, he's the president. He's going to get sworn in. There's no way to prevent that. But what he should be doing is saying, I'm going to do everything I can to get to the bottom of this. I'm going to support a congressional bipartisan commission to make sure this never happens again. Vladimir Putin was the head of the KGB. He understands how to do this work. And we cannot allow the Russians or any other foreign government to interfere with our elections.
Circling back, your tax release legislation, while interesting, doesn't give you all of what you're looking for in terms of business conflict of interest and the like. The Russian hearings, the hearings on Russia's intervention, which will happen one way or the other, no doubt, because key Republicans want to see this thing.
Absolutely.
I think will give you more in terms of the financial conflict stuff, if any, than the tax returns will. So those tax returns.
Well, vis-a-vis Russia, but I
Exactly.
think the tax returns will give us a broader view of where those investments are around the world.
Categories of business rather than specifics. However, interesting. When we come back, our governor is not going to the inauguration. There are 45 Washington Democrats that say they're not going. We'll see what the congressman's doing on Friday when we come back. Stay with us.
I have my hands full here. My budget's due on Thursday, but I wish him well.
But I wish him well, meaning she's not going. And Joe Trillo, who co-chaired the Trump campaign, said this about that.
The governor's making a mistake by not going to the inauguration. Don't poke the bull in the eye, because it could come back to bite you.
All right, there are 45 congressional Democrats that have said they're not attending this, which is provocative. Our governor is not going. We'll get your thought on that in seconds. Are you going?
I am going.
Because?
Well, first let me just say that the 45 colleagues who are not going are people who I have tremendous respect for. And I think some people think the best way and the most powerful statement that you can make in opposition to the incoming administration and the policies that he has articulated and what he's done in his transition is to boycott or not be present. I think it's a very powerful statement. I understand why they're doing it. I think for me, the reason it's important to go is I think it's my responsibility as a federal official. This is an oath of office of our president. I have respect to the office, not necessarily because of any respect for the individual, but I also want Donald Trump to know that a group of us in the Congress are going to be there from the moment he begins his work to hold him accountable, to be able to know that he has a fight on his hands, and to not really abandon the field to the guy. This is going to be a really serious responsibility to take on this administration when they're proposing things that are harmful to Rhode Island and to our country. Well, and I want to be in the fight. I want to be present on the field.
I got to say, I think that's mature of you. What about the governor?
You know, I was mentioning to you earlier, I don't know that governors always go to the inaugurations, so it doesn't surprise me that
Hillary
they go.
Clinton was elected, she would have moved every mountain
But my
to be
guess
there.
is that's because there was a personal relationship. She campaigned for Governor Raimondo. They have a personal friendship. So, but you know, I don't know whether governors historically go to presidential inaugurations. We're federal officials. We're sort of part of that federal level of government.
Given that, let's stipulate for sport that it is kind of custom. It's a
Yeah.
It's a hand.
No, I think,
a
look,
hand.
I think everyone has to figure out what is the most powerful way to kind of send a message.
Then send it.
Yeah, no, I think
It's like, send it. I'm not going, I don't
Right.
like the guy.
No, and that's
You know,
colleagues of mine
I'm picking a fight from Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Here we go, game on.
Yeah.
Or, you know, this.
Yeah.
Anyway, good to see you. Thank
Good
you.
to see
Thank
you.
you for popping back in. I find it interesting that when it comes to Donald Trump, you and I are probably seeing more eye to eye on a lot of this than not, which is going to create, I think, an interesting political dynamic for the country.
I agree.
I mean, how many traditional fights have you and I had on or off the
Right.
air? And now we're kind of like, yeah. Everything seems to be hybriding and morphing. Thought on that real quick.
No, and I think we're going to see that in Congress. I think there are some opportunities for Republicans and Democrats to work together to try to manage the unpredictability of the president. So I think it presents some opportunities, but also there are some real dangers. And I hope that this will be a successful period in our country's history because it matters to Rhode Island and to our country. But we have to be ready for a big fight on a lot of occasions.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Good to see you. We'll be right back for the final word. Stay with us. Oh, if you watch this at 7:30, you probably caught the governor if you're civic-minded with her State of the State. If you're watching at midnight, you've got some notes on all that is Washington and the like. We'll do both tomorrow night. We'll cover with Dan McGowan some of the points of the governor's State of the State, some provocative financial points, and the latest of Washington as well from a Brown professor who gets it. Hope you have a great night. See you at the radio at 3 on WPRO. Thanks for watching. Good night.